How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the very first episode of Forward America. My name is Aaron Smith, and I am so excited to be here with you all today. Forward America is the natural evolution, if you will, of Forward Gettysburg. In Forward America, not only will I be talking about the American Civil War, of course I'll be touching base with the Battle of Gettysburg. That's my number one passion. But to make this more exciting, make this more interesting, do something different, challenge myself, push myself, and bring something that you guys will enjoy even more, I've decided to branch off and talk about not just Civil War history, but all of American history. And in the spirit of that, this very first episode, I have something super exciting planned. You see, last weekend, I had the pleasure of going to Fort Necessity. Now, I didn't really know a whole lot about the French and Indian War. So when I was out in Pittsburgh with my girlfriend and she said, "Hey, let's go check out Fort Necessity," I was like, you know what? I'm down. And man, what an absolute treat. Before I get any further into this episode, I do want to apologize. I still am fighting this sinus infection thing. I was COVID negative. I'm not sure what's going on, but I might sound a little nasally. I might have a little bit of that Squidward tentacles sound to me throughout this episode. So I do apologize. I hope it doesn't make you guys click off because this is going to be a super exciting one. Now, by the time I decided I wanted to make an episode about Fort Necessity, I was already back here in Gettysburg. So I did film some footage. I did take some really cool pictures. So I'm going to kind of splice those in as I talk about what happened at Fort Necessity. And by far the most interesting part is most of this story, if not all of it, revolves around a very young George Washington. Now, when I think of George Washington, I think of this great mythical figure in American history. You know, one of the founders of our nation, one of the founding fathers. But the George Washington in this story is a man who is about 21, 22 years of age. Now, George Washington, up to this point, he had done some work as a surveyor, but he never really got the formal education that his brothers did. So, let's go back in time, if you will, to the 1750s. Pretty much everything west of the Appalachian Mountains is frontier. And there are two colonial powers that are fighting over that frontier, especially an area of the frontier called the Forks of the Ohio, where modern-day Pittsburgh is. And these two colonial powers, of course, are Great Britain and France. And the Forks of the Ohio is so important because all of the rivers west of that point lead to the Mississippi River and the middle of the North American continent. If you can control the Forks of the Ohio, you can control an enormous swath of land. So this is kind of where we're set up. Also in play here are the 5, later 6 nations of the Iroquois, and these are going to be Native Americans. The Iroquois Confederacy, or the 6 nations of the Iroquois, they have treaties with both sides, treaties for trade, all these things, and they have a pretty good thing going. You know, the French and the British are kind of letting them do their own thing, and they're making out through all this trade. So a lot of this is going to start to pop off in 1752, where the Marquis Duquesne, just kidding, the Marquis Duquesne, and I will also say I never took French in school. I'm going to try my best. So the Marquis Duquesne, in 1752, he will come to North America, and he will begin to build a series of forts on the western frontier. One of those forts being Fort Duquesne. Right there, if you have ever been to Pittsburgh where the three rivers meet, that is Fort Duquesne, later on Fort Pitt, but that's not in this story. He will build Fort Duquesne. And Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie of the Virginia colony, who is an interesting figure, he will see that French fort building as essentially moving into what he thinks is British territory. And Dinwiddie also happens to have a share, a vested interest in the Ohio Company, one of these land speculating companies that were very prevalent during the time when North America was being colonized. And so Dinwiddie, seeing the French moving into and making territorial claims there at the forks of the Ohio, as well as realizing, hey, probably not the best for business, he is, some red flags are certainly going to be raised for him, and he's going to do something about it. So what he's going to do is he's going to initially send out a small diplomatic group led by none other than George Washington. So why would Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie send George Washington? This young 20-something-year-old has no formal education, has very little, if any, military experience. Why would he send him? Kind of an odd choice to send this young kid, if you will, with such an important diplomatic message. That message being, hey, France, skedaddle, get out of here, vacate your claims. Not only that, but George Washington, he spoke no French. I mean, what kind of diplomat is that, sending someone that speaks no French to talk to the Frenchman? He's going to pick George Washington for a couple pretty decent reasons. First, George Washington had been making connections in Virginia. He had done a lot of work as a surveyor, and he had gained the attention and the endorsement of Lord Thomas Fairfax, a very high up person in Virginia at the time. So he has an endorsement of this very well-respected man. Not only that, but George Washington, he has the ambition, the drive to get into the British military and move up through the ranks, and not only move up through the military ranks, but move up through the ranks of the planter gentry in Virginia. George Washington also was just simply willing and able to endure this harsh trip. If you think about it, this is frontier. We didn't have the Pennsylvania Turnpike, 76 out the 376 taking you right there to downtown Pittsburgh to the Forks. None of that existed. These roads would essentially have to be built as they go. So George Washington, he had this drive, he had this willingness, this hardiness to endure these terrible conditions, especially since he's going to go on this trip in late fall, early winter of 1753. So you can imagine the harsh conditions. If you've ever been to Western Pennsylvania, it's all mountains. Like it's outrageous. You get past, Adams County, Chambersburg, like it is all mountains. It's pretty incredible. Beautiful country. So George Washington, he's willing and able to endure these harsh conditions out west on the frontier. So he's going to go on his journey again in late fall, early winter of 1753, and he's going to make contact with several of these forts, and he's going to pass a message along, and the French are going to kind of blow him off. We're not at war. Who are you? Get out of here, George. Yeah, whatever, get out of here. George Washington's going to kind of get blown off by the French. And Washington's actually going to make several of these trips. This is a 500-mile trip from Virginia. This is no small journey. And he's going to make several of these trips. And throughout the course of these trips, he is going to be constantly coming back to this natural landmark on the way to that area called the Great Meadow. And it's a beautiful scenic place. It is a meadow with two streams running through it, surrounded by mountains in the Laurel Highlands section of Pennsylvania, if you're familiar with southwestern Pennsylvania. Beautiful, beautiful place. And the Great Meadow is going to kind of make an impact on George Washington. And he's going to kind of keep it in the back of his mind. And so because this area is so inhospitable, there's really no waypoints or anything or places to rest for the British. George Washington's going to develop this fort. And really the fort is nothing more than a small little storehouse about 15 by 15 feet, surrounded by a stockade about 53 feet in diameter. It's really not much. So George Washington is going to develop this fort, and he is going to refer to it as our Fort of Necessity, Fort Necessity. So now we're starting to get into late spring, early summer of 1754. On May 28th, Washington will receive a message from a native leader named Half King Tenagreason. Half King. And Half King's kind of a very interesting figure. See, Half King kind of realized that many of the natives that his people had allied with were leaning more towards the French. And Half King didn't really care for the French. He wanted the natives to ally more with the British. He saw more benefit from being allied with the Englishmen. So Half King, knowing that George Washington is going on these diplomatic missions in Western Pennsylvania, he is going to give a message to George Washington saying, hey, there are some Frenchmen about 7 miles north of here. I think they're up to no good. I think they're planning to attack you. If, I could probably lead you to them and we could get the jump on them. So Washington says, bet, show me where the Frenchmen are. So he's going to be led to this group of Frenchmen, about 34, 35 Frenchmen. Half King is going to show them where they are. They are in a small little rocky outcrop. They're at the bottom of the outcrop, and they're at camp, just kind of doing their camp stuff. The story there's two sides to this story. The French side, of course, is that the British attacked them unprovoked. And the British side is that the Frenchmen saw the British laying in wait, grabbed their muskets, and started to fire upon the British. So one of those historical things, which side is correct. Either way, there's going to be an ambush upon these Frenchmen, and about 14 of them are going to be wounded or killed initially, including Ensign Joseph de Calonne de Villiers de Jumonville, or as the anglicized name, Jumonville. And Jumonville, he's going to be wounded. He's going to be trying to explain the message he had for George Washington, which is essentially the same message Washington has had for all the Frenchmen. That message being, hey, we know you're operating in the area, get out, this is French territory. As Jumonville is trying to explain this message to George Washington, Half King and his band of warriors will begin to attack and kill the remaining survivors. And this is where things begin to take a turn. You see, Ensign Jumonville was a diplomat for the French. And if anybody knows anything about warfare, attacking and killing a diplomat is an incredibly justified cause for war. So Washington is going to kind of watch all this go around him in shock and horror as these natives are just savagely tomahawking and war clubbing these wounded Frenchmen to death. Washington is going to go back to Fort Necessity. Meanwhile, word has gotten out that Ensign Jumonville has been killed. And his brother, he is going to catch wind of this. And he is going to mount a retaliatory expedition against the British. Now, Washington, he has received reinforcements, about 100 South Carolinians. There is also going to be a detachment of British regulars on their way. And as they're on their way, Colonel Joshua Fry, he is going to pass away. So now Washington is the leading commander of these troops at Fort Necessity. However, the British regulars, they don't recognize Washington's authority. They're going to be acting under the authority of their own captain. So Washington has all these things going on, all these complicated diplomatic weavings of a web involving the natives, and now he has to deal with a group of British regulars that aren't going to recognize his authority because he's a colonist. He's not a British regular, he's a colonist. He's some guy, some 21-year-old colonist. Even though he is a lieutenant colonel by rank, the regulars aren't going to recognize him. Washington has a lot going on for a 21, 22-year-old. So there's this retaliatory expedition set out by the French, by Jumonville's brother. And it's going to be about, some estimates give it as low as 600. Some of the markers and monuments at Fort Necessity gave the number as high as 900. It's going to be a significant number more, almost 2-to-1 advantage over the British, who are going to have about 400 to 500 men at Fort Necessity. Now, remember, I told you Fort Necessity is only 53 feet in diameter. You walk in there, it is incredibly small. It is rather surprising how small Fort Necessity is. But the English, they're going to build some trenches and whatnot. They're going to mount some cannons, very famously what they like to use in their logo now. The National Park Service using for Fort Necessity is that little grasshopper cannon there, mounted on a stump. They're going to dig in and get ready for this French attack. And another part of the plan, as I was at Fort Necessity and speaking with the park ranger about this, was that Washington wanted to clear the meadow out so that Fort Necessity itself was outside of musket range from the tree line. You see, when you're at Fort Necessity, the Great Meadow lies in a valley surrounded by forest, surrounded by hills going into mountains. It's kind of incredible that George Washington decided to build a fort at the bottom of this valley, at the bottom of this meadow. It's not a great location. I'm no expert in military anything, but I would think a fort, I'd want to build it, near some natural fortifications themselves, either on top of a hill or built into the side of, some rocky outcroppings, stuff like that, some natural defenses. But no, Fort Necessity is a stockade, a small little storehouse in the bottom of a valley. It's rather incredible. You get out there, you look at it, and you're like, oh, George, my guy, what were you thinking? July 3rd, 1754. The French attack Fort Necessity, and they're going to attack from several directions. It's raining. It's a torrential rain. So here we have these Frenchmen firing with their flintlock rifles, something that when it gets wet, when that powder gets wet, it's not going to fire. But the Frenchmen, they're under the cover of these trees that are well within musket range of the fort, of the British in these trenches. Not only that, but the British are just surrounded by Frenchmen. They're fighting in these trenches. It's inhospitable fighting. The trenches are filling with water, filling with blood of the wounded and the killed. And eventually, Washington and the British forces will be forced to capitulate. They'll be forced to surrender. Because England and France weren't at war with one another at the time, Jumonville's brother, leading this expedition, can't take people prisoners, none of this stuff. He sends out the terms of surrender to Washington. He says, we will let you go if you surrender. Now, this is where one of the greatest historical blunders in American history occurs. You see, Washington had a translator, a Dutchman who really barely spoke English, claimed to speak French, but barely spoke French at that. So he receives these terms of surrender. The terms of surrender are written in French. And Washington not being able to speak French was kind of a point of embarrassment for the young Washington. Here he was supposed to be this gentleman rising through the ranks, and he can hardly speak a word of French. So he has his translator look over the terms. Washington, no doubt being embarrassed, took whatever the translator said at face value and signed off on it. What Washington didn't realize is that in those terms of surrender, he agreed to admitting to the assassination of Jumonville, a French diplomat. Now, this became not just regional or colonial news at the time, but this became world news. You see, this small little conflict at Fort Necessity and the ambush at Jumonville Glen led to what many historians argue was the First World War, the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War was a subset of that larger conflict, but this was the match to the powder keg that set off one of the greatest conflicts of the 18th century on the European continent. And it all started with our American hero, George Washington. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me. That's what I have for you today. Again, if you get a chance, go check out Fort Necessity. It's about an hour south of Pittsburgh, in that area of the country there, southwestern Pennsylvania. If you're in northern West Virginia, western Maryland, it's worth your time. Check it out. Great park rangers. The museum. Guys, the museum was incredible. I was truly impressed. I remember sitting there and I had these very old man moments sometimes, sitting there on a bench, and we're talking about the French and Indian War, Missy and I said, you know, God bless the National Park Service. They do great work. And it felt good to say that outside of Gettysburg, of course. They do great work. And she looked at me, she said, you really are an old man, aren't you? And I'm like, what can I say? But Fort Necessity, they did a great job. The stockade and storehouse at Fort Necessity now are reproductions, but still very much worth your time. Another cool part that they discussed was the National Road, the first highway across what was then the nation. And that was really cool. They have the Mount Washington Tavern, definitely worth a walk through. Just an incredible sight. Definitely worth your time. Not only that, but we checked out the grave of Edward Braddock. The story goes that Braddock was leading a force to take Fort Duquesne, and they were ambushed by Indians, Braddock himself being mortally wounded. Braddock was a bit of a son of a bitch himself, which I'll probably get into an episode about Braddock because he's so cool. Not really, son of a bitch. But, you know, they were so worried about Braddock's body being, you know, disrespected and just abused by the natives. They didn't want him to be scalped or anything, that they buried him in the road and then put the dirt over top and marched the soldiers over top of it. So we went to the relocation of Braddock's grave up on top of a hill, and also to Braddock's original grave site on the Braddock Road Trace. Also a really cool spot, maybe like a mile down the road from Fort Necessity. But anyway, that's what I have for you, our Fort of Necessity. As always, my name is Aaron Smith. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video if you enjoyed it. Leave me a comment down below. And as always, I will catch you on the next one.